We've all heard about the transatlantic slave trade, but how much do you truly know about it? Where was the very first slave plantation established? When did the first slave get sold? And why weren't there any slave plantations in Europe? In this video, we'll dive deep into the history of the transatlantic slave trade, tracing its roots from the first enslaved individuals to the peak of the trade. Chapter 1: European Slavery. To truly understand transatlantic slavery, we first need to explore European slavery. In most of Europe, slavery was commonplace and owning slaves was a status symbol. This indicated that the owner was either wealthy enough to purchase slaves or powerful enough to capture them. Interestingly, European slaves had basic human rights. They couldn't be abused, they could hold positions of power, and their children were born free. But if you were born free, how did you become a slave? Slaves were typically captured. Raiding parties would travel by boat, land near a village or town, and capture everyone to sell into slavery. These captives were torn from their families and lives, forced into labor for others. The Vikings were the most notorious slave raiders in Europe, so much so that Northern Europe developed governments and armies specifically to defend against their attacks. By the 15th century, these better defenses had ended slave raids in Northern Europe, pushing the practice southward. Southern Europe, predominantly Christian, bordered North Africa and the Middle East, which were mostly Muslim. According to both religions, it was permissible to enslave people of different faiths, making it acceptable for Christians to enslave Muslims and vice versa. However, it wasn't acceptable to enslave someone of the same faith. Consequently, each side targeted the other, resulting in the enslavement of thousands of people annually. Slave raiding was risky. Potential resistance could lead to death, eliminating any profit. Thus, trading slaves became a safer alternative. The most valuable slaves were from West Africa. Europeans and Asians considered West Africans ideal slaves because they were accustomed to hot climates, making them capable of hard work. They also had strong immunity to many diseases. Additionally, their dark skin was seen as exotic, and many wealthy individuals purchased West African slaves for companionship. These slaves were captured during wars or slave raids in West Africa, transported through the Sahara, and sold in North Africa. From there, they were shipped to slave markets in Europe, the Middle East, and even as far as China and Japan. This trade involved only a few thousand slaves per year, making it profitable but small compared to the transatlantic slave trade. There are reports of certain kings selling thousands or even tens of thousands of slaves at once, but these were rare occurrences. Why was the slave trade so small? After all, owning slaves meant more work, more money, and more slaves. The reason was the existence of serfs. A serf was a person forced to work on land owned by a lord. They had to give most of their harvest to the lord. The value of a serf came from the food they could produce, and this was only possible if they had land to cultivate. Therefore, the number of serfs a lord needed depended on the amount of farmland they owned. If a lord wanted to buy a slave, they needed land for the slave to work on. But if there was extra land or more workers were needed for something else, indentured servants were a cheaper alternative. An indentured servant was forced to work for someone for a limited time, after which they regained their freedom. There were three types of indentured servants: criminals serving punishment through forced labor, people repaying debts through forced labor, and individuals who sold themselves into servitude for money. For example, a contract between Henry Mayer and Abraham Heston showed that Abraham paid for Henry's travel to America, and in return, Henry worked for Abraham for 3 years. These servants were cheaper, spoke the same language, and had experience, which is why the slave trade in Europe was small. Slaves were bought on a small scale by craftspeople, churches, or as personal servants. What if you could buy cheaper slaves? West African slaves were expensive because they had to travel via the Sahara. Looking at a map of the trans-Saharan slave trade, there were only a few routes traders could use. Those who controlled these narrow routes could demand high prices. It required a lot of supplies, camels, and money to cross safely. Sailing around the Sahara was not an option, because if you look at the West Saharan coastline, you will notice there are no settlements there. That's because there is almost no life in that part of the world. Look at this picture from Google Maps of the Western Sahara coastline. There's no life here, making it impossible to grow food. Ships traveling from North Africa to West Africa had no ports to resupply, needing more cargo space for supplies and less for trade goods. This made it unprofitable. So who would even be crazy enough to try this? Chapter 2. Portugal. Portugal was the only country capable of this feat. In the 15th century, England and Scotland were rivals focused on their own issues. England and France were locked in a 100-year war, and Spain was engulfed in a civil war. Other countries were either too far away or earned more by trading in the Mediterranean. Portugal, having stabilized after a civil war in the 14th century that killed most of its nobility, shifted its focus to trade and building a middle class. This middle class was passionate about trading and invested in developing bigger and faster ships, like the caravel with its triangular mast, which allowed the ship to travel much faster. So fast, in fact, that it could travel to West Africa and still turn a profit. Portugal aimed to sail to Asia for spices, which required navigating around Africa. They needed to map Africa's coast to find a route, so they sent explorers who traded with West Africans along the way. In 1441, the first West African slaves were brought back, with 12 sold in Portugal, marking Europe's official entry into the West African slave trade. Buying enslaved Africans was costly, so in 1444, the first European slave raids in West Africa began, encouraged by the Roman Catholic Church. The church believed dark-skinned people were cursed based on a biblical story. According to the Bible, after the Great Flood, Noah built an ark for his family and animals, saving humanity. One day, Noah was naked, and his son Ham saw him. Noah cursed Ham and his descendants, which the church claimed caused dark skin tones, thus justifying the enslavement of black Africans. This explanation is incredibly absurd and one of the craziest ideas we've discussed in our History Scope videos. But while the West African slave rates were profitable, they were also very dangerous for two main reasons. The first was malaria. About half of all humans who contracted malaria died from it. The parasite couldn't survive in colder climates, so Europeans, lacking immunity, quickly succumbed to the disease. The second reason was that African ships were highly effective at defending the rivers and coastline, causing many Portuguese slave raids to fail when faced with strong West African resistance. So they tried a different approach. Portugal sent diplomats to West Africa to negotiate trade deals. Some Portuguese people settled and integrated into the local cultures, serving as interpreters, while merchants were sent to the slave markets. By 1458, Portugal had signed treaties with various West African countries, agreeing to stop slave raiding in exchange for access to West African slave markets. From this point on, Portugal focused on trading enslaved Africans rather than capturing them. Chapter 3. Colonization. To make travel to West Africa easier, the Portuguese established colonies, one of the first being Madeira. It was a perfect place to resupply ships traveling between Europe and West Africa, but it initially seemed like a terrible place to earn money because it was uninhabited before the Portuguese arrived. Without local workers, they attempted to establish a serf system like in Spain, but few people wanted to move to an isolated island in the middle of the ocean. Then fortune struck. One farmer decided to plant sugar cane, discovering that Madeira was ideal for it, hot, wet, and fertile. The only other places in Europe suitable for growing sugar were Cyprus, southern Spain, and southern Portugal. So, Portuguese sugar planters were brought to Madeira, and they needed more workers. But with not enough serfs, they turned to indentured servants, forcing them to grow sugar. They quickly profited and wanted more money, more sugar, more plantations. However, this required hard labor, and Europeans weren't accustomed to tropical climates. Thus, Madeira began purchasing slaves from West Africa. Starting in the 1440s, they bought about 1,000 slaves in that decade. Initially, these slaves weren't used in the fields. Instead, they built farmland for serfs and indentured servants. When the first sugar plantations needed to be built, it was this army of enslaved Africans that did it. By the 15th century, Madeira had transformed into a giant sugar factory, with terraces, canals, sugar mills, and roads primarily constructed by enslaved Africans. Once the plantations were built, they bought more slaves and indentured servants to grow sugar cane. To sustain this, Portuguese slave ships regularly traveled to West African slave markets. By the 1460s, several hundred enslaved Africans were bought and sold each year. In the 15th century, when trade was very profitable, the government created monopolies. A monopoly was a license purchased from the government, granting exclusive rights to trade in a particular commodity within the country. No one else could do business in that industry unless permitted by the monopoly holder. In the case of slavery, a monopoly gave a specific person, company, or family the right to trade in slaves within the Portuguese Empire. This made it illegal for anyone else to trade in slaves unless they bought a license from the monopoly holder. Governments did this to ensure people paid taxes. For instance, Portugal had a monopoly on all tuna fishing in southern Portugal. To fish tuna, you had to pay the monopoly holder for the right to fish. The government would then know you were a tuna fisher and could tax you accordingly. If you fished tuna without a license, you could be arrested. This system allowed the government to earn money from selling monopolies, collect taxes, and let the monopoly holders profit from selling licenses. And the same happened with slavery. Portugal's king granted the first monopoly to his son, Henry the Navigator. He then sold licenses to other slave traders. After his death, the monopoly was sold to someone else. The slave trade grew slowly, and by the end of the 15th century, Spain had ended their civil war and sought new opportunities, including the slave trade. Instead of building forts and colonies, they made a treaty with Portugal. Spain would buy West African slaves from Portugal, and Portugal would renounce any claim to the Spanish throne. This was significant because Spain was about to start its own colonial empire. Chapter 4: From Tribes to Serfs. The first European to arrive in America was Eric the Red, who set foot on Greenland in 982. The second expedition was led by Christopher Columbus, funded by the Spanish government. Columbus had transported sugar between Madeira and Europe, gaining valuable ocean navigation experience. He used this to sail across the Atlantic to find Asia, but instead landed in the Caribbean. Initially, there seemed to be little of value to the Europeans. No gold, silver, or spices. But Columbus was determined to make his voyage profitable. He enslaved 24 Native Americans and sold them in Spain, claiming he could enslave 4,000 Native Americans per year. To facilitate this, the Americas needed to be colonized. For the next few decades, slaves were captured in the Americas and shipped to Spain or its colonies. However, many people in Spain saw a different potential in the Native Americans. Instead of turning them into slaves, they could be turned into serfs. To understand why the Spanish turned Native Americans into serfs, we need to look at the history of Spain and Portugal. In the 11th century, this region was under Muslim rule and Christians felt under siege from Muslim invasions in both Spain and Turkey. This led to a series of holy wars to reclaim these lands. For 400 years, European Christians traveled to what we now call Spain and Portugal to conquer territory. Conquering land meant ruling it, and when you died, your sons inherited your lands, but not all of them. The youngest sons of minor lords often inherited nothing, so they joined these holy wars to acquire new land. By 1492, all of Spain and Portugal had been reclaimed by the Christians. Suddenly, the younger sons of nobility had no way to advance in the social hierarchy. In that same year, America was discovered, prompting the nobility to do what they had always done: conquer new territory and hand it over to the nobles. These nobles needed serfs to work the land, and there were hundreds of thousands of Native Americans available. The Spanish began to conquer the Americas over centuries, forcing Native Americans to work for them. However, they soon encountered a problem. Native Americans died from European diseases. A dead person is an unproductive person, and within 20 years, most Native Americans in Cuba had perished. For instance, Cuba's population dropped from 350,000 in 1492 to just 35,000 20 years later. Puerto Rico's population plummeted from 30,000 in 1509 to just 1,148 in 1529. The Taino tribe, which once had 500,000 people, now has none left, with only a few thousand modern descendants. Initially, these deaths were accidental as the Spanish were unaware of the impact of their diseases. Once they realized what was happening, they decided to essentially enslave the native populations, reasoning that since the natives were going to die anyway, they might as well extract as much labor as possible. Native Americans were forced to work in mines, farms, and sugar plantations, and some were even sold off to Spain. Chapter 5. From Serfs to Indentured Servants. By 1510, the Spanish government was deeply disappointed with their colonies. They had been promised a land full of potential slaves, serfs, and gold, but the reality was that the slaves and serfs died, and their income dwindled. Desperate for new workers, they attempted to bring more serfs from Spain, but the dangers, expenses, and likelihood of never returning home dissuaded many. Living in a sunny place, working for a lord, was the same in Spain as in the Americas, offering little incentive to move. To meet their labor demands, the colonies began to rely heavily on indentured servants. However, they needed so many that the price of indentured servants soared, leading to the rise of criminal organizations forcing people into servitude. They employed two main methods: luring children with candy and tricking them into signing contracts, and getting adults drunk to get their signatures. By the time these individuals sobered up, they were already on a ship bound for the Americas. Seeing an opportunity, the government decided to create indentured servants themselves. Various crimes, including hindering customs officers, poaching, losing in a revolution, resisting occupation, or practicing the wrong religion, became punishable by indentured servitude. Most of these individuals were shipped to the American colonies. The colonies followed the model of Madeira. By now, the Caribbean was almost uninhabited, similar to Madeira. The Spanish set up small farms for food using serfs, and then offered loans to those wanting to build plantations. With this money, they bought indentured servants to grow sugar cane. The Spanish plantations in the Caribbean expanded so extensively that Spain eventually faced a shortage of indentured servants. The limited population in Spain could not meet the labor demands of the colonies, and the indentured servants who were available struggled to endure the tropical heat. As a result, the colonies began purchasing enslaved Africans from Spain and Portugal, which proved beneficial for Spain due to the high cost of West African slaves, leading to significant profits when sold to the colonies. Initially, enslaved Africans were transported to Portugal and Spain before being sent to the Americas. Despite their high cost, West African slaves were preferred for 6 key reasons. First, West Africa had a vast number of potential slaves, providing an endless supply. Secondly, these slaves were immune to many diseases that decimated the European and Native American populations. Thirdly, they had experience growing European crops and working with European farm animals, making them valuable laborers. Fourthly, they were accustomed to working in hot climates similar to the Caribbean. Fifth, their unfamiliarity with the Caribbean terrain made it difficult for them to escape successfully. Lastly, their dark skin made them easily identifiable among the lighter-skinned non-slave population, simplifying the recapture of escapees. Enslaved Africans were subjected to the same brutal treatment as the indentured servants. They were thrown into the ocean if they got sick, beaten if they didn't work hard enough, and worked to death. This extreme cruelty was driven by a simple economic rationale: maximizing profit. Slaves were considered expendable labor. Plantation owners believed that overworking and replacing them was more profitable than treating them well and ensuring their longevity. Since slaves had no legal rights and could not claim freedom after a period of service like indentured servants, they were seen purely as property. The more brutal the exploitation, the higher the profit for the plantation owners. This system of maximum brutality for maximum profit was justified by the prevailing European belief that forced labor was a way to compel the lazy or undesirable elements of society to contribute productively. The transition from indentured servitude to slavery in the Spanish colonies was driven by economic necessity, the declining availability of indentured servants, and the perceived advantages of using enslaved Africans. The system of exploitation evolved to prioritize profitability, leading to the widespread and horrific abuses of slavery in the Americas. A dead slave is an unproductive slave, so why would the plantation owners want them to die? The reason lies in the economics of slavery. A slave was only profitable for about 10 years. Once they reached their 30s, it became more difficult for them to do hard labor, and the plantation owner would start losing money. From a purely financial perspective, Working a person to death by the time they reached their 30s meant extracting the maximum value from their labor during their most productive years. This economic rationale also explains why slaves were rarely bred in the Americas. Children cost more to raise than they could produce on a plantation, and only after about 15 years would they begin to generate real profit. Consequently, slave owners preferred to buy healthy young males in their late teens or early 20s. Admiral Sir George Young succinctly captured this mindset, stating, "Purchasing slaves was much the cheapest method of keeping up their numbers. For the mother of a bred slave was taken from the field labor for 3 years, which labor was of more value than the cost of a new slave." Enslaved Africans entered a system already characterized by extreme brutality. For 3 centuries, they and indentured servants worked side by side on slave plantations. This pattern was followed by other colonizers as well. The Portuguese, French, British, and Dutch began with serfs, transitioned to indentured servants, and eventually turned to purchasing slaves. While each nation had slightly different approaches, the process I described for Spain repeated itself in almost every American colony until the transatlantic slave trade ended. Despite the harsh treatment of enslaved Africans, there was some limited resistance. Spain and Portugal, for instance, passed laws restricting the number of slaves that could be carried on a ship, regulating the amount of food they should receive, and mandating a rest day on Sundays. However, these rules were easily circumvented. Plantation owners would simply classify more slaves as crew and then sell them upon arrival in the colonies. Bribery ensured that inspectors turned a blind eye, and those who followed the laws were easily outcompeted by others who did not. A common smuggling tactic involved arranging for an attack on the ship, where the attackers would steal the slaves and coincidentally drop a bag of silver equivalent to the cost of the slaves. Within a decade, Congo had sold 5,000 slaves, established Portuguese embassies, and converted to Christianity. This conversion was strategic, as Christians could enslave people of other faiths, making Congo the only Christian country in the region with the ability to enslave their neighbors. This led Congo to become a militaristic state, constantly warring with surrounding tribes to capture more slaves for the Portuguese. As American colonies expanded, their demand for slaves grew, leading to an increase in Congo's conflicts. The Spanish colonies, in particular, required vast numbers of slaves due to the high mortality rates among Native Americans. In 1530, Spain established its own slave trade monopoly, making the trade highly profitable and a coveted geopolitical asset. Holding the monopoly meant immense wealth and influence, so many nations sought to obtain it. Meanwhile, Portugal had also developed slave plantations, but continued to rely on Native American slaves until two epidemics in the 1560s devastated the native population in Brazil. By the 1570s, Portugal switched to enslave Africans, and by 1600, both Portugal and Spain had colonies producing sugar with slave labor. Between 1576 and 1591, Portugal bought nearly 50,000 slaves, averaging over 3,000 per year. In 1580, the Portuguese and Spanish empires merged when the King of Portugal died, and the King of Spain, his cousin, inherited Portugal. This consolidation gave Spain complete control over the transatlantic slave trade, from the supply of slaves to the production of sugar. This raises the question, why was sugar so central to the transatlantic slave trade and the related conflicts in West Africa? In the 16th century, Europeans began to grow wealthier due to advancements in tools, basic machinery, and more efficient agricultural practices. As people moved out of poverty, one of the first luxuries they sought was sugar, which provided a cheap and quick source of calories. According to UN statistics, improving access to calories is a priority for those moving out of poverty. As Europeans' demand for sugar increased, Spain needed to expand its plantations, necessitating more slaves. This relentless demand meant that Spain could never have enough slaves to meet the sugar consumption needs of Europe. Chapter 8: Competition. The first significant threat to Spanish dominance came from the Dutch. The Dutch Republic had been part of the Spanish Empire until they sought independence. When the Dutch joined the transatlantic slave trade, they initially operated under the Spanish system, refining sugar and selling it across Europe. However, Their relationship with Spain took a drastic turn in 1579 when the Dutch Republic declared its independence and engaged in the 80 Years' War against Spain. This conflict cut off the Dutch from purchasing sugar cane from Spanish-controlled territories, forcing them to establish their own sugar production. Drawing on their previous experience from the Spanish Empire, the Dutch began setting up sugar plantations in what is now Brazil, gradually conquering most of the northeastern parts of South America. They followed the familiar pattern of starting with Native American workers, transitioning to indentured servants, and eventually relying heavily on enslaved Africans. The Dutch financed these ventures through an innovative financial model that leveraged the middle class. Instead of individual investors owning entire ships, they could buy shares in a company that owned multiple ships, spreading the risk of loss. This system allowed investors to own a percentage of several ships, reducing the financial risk of any single ship sinking. The Dutch established national companies to manage their long-distance trading ventures. For the transatlantic slave trade, they created the Dutch West India Company in 1621. This company held the monopoly on all trade with the American colonies. To trade, individuals had to join the company as traders rather than purchasing individual licenses. Initially, the Dutch West India Company was reluctant to engage in the slave trade. They believed that wealth came from fostering a strong middle class with disposable income. Since slaves had no money to spend, they saw each enslaved person as a potential lost customer. This was in line with early capitalist philosophy, where economic prosperity was tied to consumerism. However, the company had its own military forces, including an army and navy, which proved useful in securing more colonies and trading posts. In some cases, they freed enslaved people, armed them, and sent them to fight against their former masters. Despite this initial opposition, the Dutch eventually found a loophole to participate in the slave trade. They conquered the Spanish trading port of Elmina, allowing them to purchase slaves indirectly from Caribbean slave markets without directly engaging in trade from West Africa. As Dutch traders and slave owners became wealthy, they lobbied the government to legalize the slave trade. Their efforts succeeded, and slave plantations became common in Dutch colonies. The Dutch also established trade ports and colonies in West Africa, positioning themselves strategically to access slave markets directly. As European powers expanded their influence, they increasingly vied for control over the lucrative transatlantic slave trade. Initially, the Dutch joined the trade, leveraging their established experience from their time in the Spanish Empire. They set up sugar plantations in Brazil and other parts of northeastern South America, following the familiar progression from Native American labor to indentured servants and finally to enslaved Africans. The Dutch financed these operations through a unique shareholder system, which allowed investors to spread financial risk across multiple ships. The Dutch West India Company, founded in 1621, monopolized trade with the American colonies. Although initially resistant to the slave trade due to its conflict with early capitalist principles, where a strong middle class of consumers was seen as more beneficial, the company eventually embraced the trade. They exploited a loophole by conquering the Spanish trading port of Elmina, allowing them to purchase slaves from Caribbean markets rather than directly from West Africa. Following the Dutch, the French entered the slave trade. By 1625, the French began establishing tobacco plantations on islands such as St. Lucia, St. Vincent, the Grenadines, and Grenada. They initially employed Native American workers and indentured servants, but joined the transatlantic slave trade by 1640. The French seized control of Senegal and Gambian slave markets, directly acquiring slaves for their colonies. The British, ever competitive, also entered the scene in the 1620s. Rather than using Native American labor, they quickly transitioned to indentured servants and enslaved Africans. By the 1630s, it was common to see both groups working on English plantations. With the influx of new European slave traders, the transatlantic slave trade overshadowed the trans-Saharan slave trade. By 1600, half of all enslaved Africans were traded via the Atlantic, diminishing the significance of Saharan traders. By 1579, Spain had complete control over the transatlantic slave trade. However, by 1629, Spain faced stiff competition from the Dutch, English, and French. To maintain dominance, Spain engaged in bloody conflicts such as the 30 Years' War. The Portuguese were particularly problematic, as they had long controlled the slave trade while Spain sought to monopolize it. Tensions escalated, with Spain arresting Portuguese traders on false charges and humiliating them publicly. In response to Spanish aggression, Portugal supported a rebellion and declared independence in 1640, fully regaining sovereignty by 1668. During the subsequent conflict, both Spain and Portugal destroyed each other's ships, severely disrupting the slave trade. The governor of Lima noted the critical role of African labor in the economy, highlighting the dependence on slaves for everything from agriculture to mining. Unable to procure slaves from each other, Spain and Portugal turned to the Dutch for support. Portugal allowed Dutch traders to take over some Portuguese colonies to deter Spanish aggression. Spain, having declared peace with the Dutch in 1648, also sought Dutch assistance for their slave needs. Despite occasional cooperation, the European powers primarily pursued their interests aggressively. The struggle for dominance among the Spanish, Portuguese, French, English, and Dutch led to numerous conflicts over control of the transatlantic slave trade and the plantations that depended on it. This competitive and often brutal pursuit shaped the trajectory of the slave trade and the geopolitical landscape of the era. In 1654, Portugal conquered Brazil, which is why Portuguese is spoken in Brazil today rather than Dutch. This victory marked a significant shift in colonial control, as the Dutch had previously established a foothold in the region. By 1664, England seized the Dutch North American colonies, further altering the balance of power. Meanwhile, in 1667, the Dutch took Suriname and transformed it into a major sugar-producing colony, employing around 22,000 slaves by 1700. European powers frequently waged wars over colonies, ports, and strategic locations. The constant conflict among European nations impacted the West African slave traders, who were concerned about the instability affecting their trade. Europeans, despite their diversity, shared a common trait of persistent warfare, which influenced the slave trade dynamics. To mitigate the negative effects of these conflicts on their profits, West African traders often aligned themselves with specific European powers to aid in their struggles against rivals. In 1665, Portugal waged war against the Kingdom of Congo to pressure them into supplying an unlimited number of slaves. This conflict led to a scarcity of slaves available for Spanish and Portuguese colonies, resulting in increased demand from other European powers. Consequently, the Dutch, French, and English ramped up their slave purchases. Between 1625 and 1650, approximately 200,000 slaves were transported to the colonies, with 100,000 going to Spanish colonies, 50,000 to Portuguese territories, and the remaining 50,000 to other colonizers. In the 17th century, European nations created national companies to monopolize the transatlantic slave trade. The Dutch West India Company, which had initially been highly successful, managed to conquer territories, build forts, and establish trade routes. They set up sugar plantations in the Caribbean and Brazil, effectively competing against Spanish and Portuguese dominance. France and England followed suit by forming their own trading companies. In 1660, the English established the Royal Adventures into Africa Company, which received a 1,000-year monopoly on the West African slave trade. The company's logo, if one could see it, symbolized the era's colonial ambitions. This organization was designed not to expand trade, but to ensure that the profits remained with the elite. By 1665, the company earned £200,000, with £100,000 from the slave trade and another £100,000 from other ventures. While slavery was profitable, it was not the primary focus for the English, as most slave plantations were owned by the Dutch, Spanish, and Portuguese. To gain control over trade routes, the slave trade, and the plantations themselves, the English engaged in a series of wars throughout the 17th century, further reshaping the landscape of the Atlantic slave trade. The French established the French West India Company, focusing on creating a trade network in North America for goods like fur and developing tobacco plantations in the Caribbean. However, they faced significant challenges and were often criticized by plantation owners for their incompetence in providing enough slaves. To compensate, French plantation owners began smuggling sugar and slaves from other European colonies. By the late 17th century, the Caribbean had become a major sugar-producing region due to the efforts of the English and French West India companies. Although Spain still had the most sugar plantations, the English and French plantations were the most efficient. For instance, Haiti became the world's largest sugar producer for a time, but at a tremendous human cost. Enslaved Africans in Haiti had an average lifespan of only 3 years, meaning plantation owners needed to purchase more slaves frequently to maintain production. By the end of the 17th century, English and French colonies dominated the sugar industry, with enslaved Africans being worked to death on sugar plantations. England faced a unique challenge. While they wanted more slaves and had the ships and colonies to support this, they struggled to trade effectively with West Africa. West Africa, primarily interested in European manufactured goods like guns, steel, and cloth, created a situation where the demand for slaves outpaced England's ability to produce these goods. England even faced shortages of these products at home due to their high export levels to West Africa. This imbalance had severe repercussions for West Africa. European goods, being superior in quality, undermined local industries, leading to widespread economic decline and contributing to the high levels of poverty seen in West Africa today. The destruction of African industry made it easier for Europeans to colonize the region in the 19th century, as there was minimal local industry to resist colonization. England, recognizing the problem, implemented laws to boost domestic industry, essentially driving its own industrial revolution to meet the demands of the West African slave trade. This effort to increase industrial output allowed England to continue trading with West Africa and obtain the slaves needed. To further secure their trade, England also began negotiating trade treaties with Scandinavia to acquire more manufactured goods. This strategy ensured that even those without direct slave plantations could benefit from the trade. This approach proved successful, helping to sustain England's involvement in the slave trade and contributing to the broader economic and industrial changes of the period. By the end of the transatlantic slave trade, England had managed to sell almost half of all enslaved Africans transported to the Americas. The demand for slaves was so high that it became economically viable to breed slaves in the English colonies rather than simply purchasing them. This led to female slaves becoming more valuable due to their potential to produce offspring. Laws were enacted to maximize the number of enslaved people. For instance, if just one parent was a slave, their child would automatically inherit that status. This cruel system meant that enslaved women were often forced to bear children for their masters, effectively creating new slaves. As competition for control over slave markets intensified, countries fought fiercely, resulting in the financial collapse of many national companies involved in the trade. By 1700, the cost of maintaining forts, ships, and slaves became unsustainable, leading to widespread bankruptcies. The Dutch Republic, which had been a major player, saw its power diminish significantly, reducing its role in the slave trade to a minor one. The Spanish, despite not having a national company, faced similar challenges and eventually ceded their monopoly to France. In gratitude, France supported Spain in a civil war to maintain its position, a practice that foreshadowed future foreign interventions in Spanish conflicts, from Napoleon to World War II Germany. France initially benefited from taking control of the slave trade after disbanding its company in 1674, but it still suffered from the intense competition. One example of the shifting alliances and political consequences was the relationship between France and Scotland. With Scotland's bankruptcy in 1707 and its subsequent union with England to form Great Britain, France lost a significant ally. This allowed Great Britain to dominate European affairs for the next 350 years, a trend that only ended when the UK left the European Union in 2020. The British themselves experienced a dramatic downfall with the South Sea Company, which was initially created to trade with the Americas. The company's failure to generate profit led to a speculative bubble. The hype around the company's potential caused share prices to soar, attracting investors from across Great Britain. However, the company could not deliver on its promises, leading to a collapse in share prices and a significant economic crisis. By the early 18th century, with the collapse of the national companies, the responsibility for managing the slave trade, colonies, and warships fell to national governments. This marked a pivotal shift in the management of the transatlantic slave trade. For a complete overview of the topic, including more details, I will be producing 2 additional videos that will be compiled into one comprehensive final video.